Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Book 2, Chapter 1.
As necessity was the first cause of industry and invention, from which wealth and power arise, it is natural that when the action of that necessity becomes less urgent, those exertions to which it gave rise will gradually fall away. Though habit may sometimes counteract this tendency, in the individual, yet taken upon a general scale, and from generation to generation, it must inevitably take place. In this case, an individual who has obtained wealth enjoys an advantage, which no nation ever can expect. With only common prudence, he may cease from exertion or industry and remain in affluence. If he has property in land, he may let it and live on the rent. If in money, he may lend it and live on the interest. But one nation cannot let its lands or lend its capital to another. It must, by its own industry, render them productive. The great bulk of every nation, then, must be industrious, however wealthy it may be. Otherwise, the wealth will soon be dissipated and disappear. The people of Flanders cannot, for example, cultivate the fields of the French and live in Flanders. And if the agriculture of a country is neglected, that country must soon become poor and miserable. It is not absolutely necessary, then, for an individual to conciliate affluence with industry, or, which is the same thing, to preserve one of the effects of necessity after the necessity has ceased to exist. But if it were possible for a sum of money or property of any sort to be given to each individual in a nation, which would be sufficient in the midst of an industrious people to enable him to live in perfect idleness, the whole nation could not become idle. Such a case never can exist, as that of all the individuals in a country becoming sufficiently rich to live without labor. But something approaching towards that state of things actually does take place when, by the general increase of wealth, the necessity for labor is diminished. The number of idle people is constantly augmenting, and even those who continue to labor do it less intensely than when the operation of necessity was more severe. When a cause is diminished, the effect must in time fall off in proportion. With individuals, nature has given very powerful auxiliaries to necessity, which strengthen and prolong its operation, but which do not operate equally on nations. Habit or custom is the one auxiliary, and ambition or avarice is the other. Habit, in all cases, diminishes the reluctance to labor, which is inherent in the most part of mankind, and sometimes entirely overcomes it. Ambition, which appears under many different forms, renders labor absolutely an enjoyment. Sometimes ambition is merely a desire of amassing property, an avaricious disposition. Sometimes it is a desire to create a family, and even, sometimes, the vain and delusive idea of retiring from business and becoming happy in a state of total idleness spurs a man on to labor. It is a very curious, but well-known fact, that, after necessity has entirely ceased to promote industry, the love of complete idleness and the hope of enjoying it at some distant date leads the wealthy man on to his last hour in a train of augmented industry. Thus has nature most wisely counteracted the disposition of man to idleness, by making the very propensity to it, after a certain time, active in promoting industry. But this can never be the case with a race of men, and as a nation consists of a greater number of individuals, so also its existence consists of successive generations. There is a difference between idleness and inaction. It is the natural propensity of man to be idle, but not to be inactive. Enjoyment is his aim after he has secured the means of existence. Enjoyment and idleness are supposed in many cases to go hand in hand. At any rate, they can be reconciled, whereas inaction and enjoyment are irreconcilable. But we may still go farther. As taste for any particular enjoyment is acquired when a man is young, and the same taste continues in a more advanced age, a man who has been long in business has had no time to acquire a taste for those enjoyments that are incompatible with, or perhaps that admit of being substituted for it. Reading the study of the fine arts, and such other means of employing time as men enjoy, who, at an early period of life, are exempted from labor, afford no amusement to the man who has been always accustomed to a life of business, with whom there is an absolute necessity of filling up the time in one way or another. A certain portion of time may be spent in company, but even that, to be enjoyed, must be spent in the society of men of the same class. The inducement, then, to a man who has dedicated the first part of his life advantageously to industry to become idle is not great, even when he is at free liberty to follow his inclination. It is totally different with a young man. His propensity is to idleness, without any of those favorable circumstances that counteract that propensity. Necessity alone can be expected to operate on him. It is in vain to seek for any other substitute. Not that we mean by idleness to signify inaction, but that sort of idleness which resists regular labor. There is a natural propensity to action, but then it is a propensity that operates irregularly, unless under the influence of necessity. It is a continued and regular exertion directed to a proper object that is wanted to obtain wealth. To procure this, it is well to imitate nature and create necessity. But, in proportion as a nation grows wealthy, that necessity is done away. It is of the art of prolonging necessity, or rather of reconciling necessity with affluence and ease, for which we are going to search, that we may by that means reconcile affluence with industry. We must, in the first place, find what the natural operation is by which industry leaves a country. When a country is in a state of poverty, it maintains the same degree of industry, from generation to generation, without any effort. The new race is brought up in the same way that the former was before it, and the same pressure of necessity, acting on the same desire, but no greater desire, to shun labor, produces the same effect at one time that it did at another. The son of a man, who has arrived at a greater degree of affluence than that to which he was born, is generally brought up differently. He is not brought up so heartily in his infancy as his father was, nor so soon called to labor. And probably when he is called to it, he is neither called with so imperious a voice, nor is he so willing to obey the call. Though we do not live long enough to see an example of this operation on a whole nation, the progression being too slow for the life of a man, yet we see it in different parts of the same country that are in different degrees of advancement. How frequent are the instances of men bred in distant counties, particularly in the north, bringing all that industry and those habits of labor to London, that the poverty of their parents and the state of their part of the country naturally occasioned. Some of those have arrived at affluence, and many of them have to competency. And even those who do not arrive at a comparatively higher rank in London than their father held in his own county bring up their children in a very different manner. Suppose, for example, a blacksmith from Northumberland or a baker from Scotland settles in London, as his father did at Newcastle or Edinburgh. His son or sons will be bred very differently from what he was. And after their father's death, the business will most probably go to some newcomer from a distant county. The father was brought up with the necessity of laboring, or the alternative of wanting food to eat. From his earliest days, he considered himself as fortunate if he could obtain a competent living by honest industry. And this impression, with the habits acquired while it was strong, led a man, so brought up, to fill his place in life with honor and advantage. The son, who sees that his father is in affluence and who partakes of the fruits of a whole life of industry, seldom considers that he must continue that industry, otherwise, that the affluence will cease with the life of his father. It is impossible to make a young man, brought up in this manner, feel as his father did, and not having the same impulse given to him at first, he never can set off in his course of life with the same energy. But the cause of this evil does not stop here. Frequently, the mother is an enemy to the industry of her son, and between the workings of real affection, badly exercised, which leads her to humor the lad, and a sort of silly vanity, equally misplaced, she encourages him, if not in idleness, at least in the hope that he will never need to stoop to incessant industry. It is not necessary to ascertain the absolute portion of idleness and pride that is infused into the young man. That depends on particular circumstances. But in most cases, it is sufficient to prevent his following the footsteps of his father with equal energy. Perhaps the capital, or the connections a father leaves in trade, may in some degree and for some time compensate for this, but the instances where they do so are not numerous. This is an example of the manner in which every succeeding generation is brought up differently from that preceding it. but it is an extreme example, and one that, though very real in the individuals, can never suddenly take place on a national scale. The difference between the general affluence of a nation and the change of its manners during the life of a man is by no means equal to the difference between a remote province and the capital of an empire. But, though the example is extreme, the same effect is produced in the course of several generations upon a nation that was occasioned by change of place in one individual family from father to son. When a change like this takes place in one family, and there are numerous instances of it every day, poverty comes on again, and the children fall back into the laborious class of society, probably in a degraded state. But as the evil is supplied by new people rising up, it is little felt on the nation. If, however, it occurs very generally, it must have a bad effect. And indeed, the best thing that can happen for the general welfare is that such men may return to a state of insignificance and labor as fast as possible. For while they remain above that, and in a declining state, they are filling their place in society badly. It is different where the change goes on through a whole country. Then no one can supply the place. They are all going the same way and at nearly the same rate. The consequence will be that this will not be the fall of a family, but the fall of a whole people. The motion will indeed be much more slow, but the moving body will be vastly greater, and the effect will be in proportion. In every nation in Europe there is, between the capital and the distant provinces, a difference of affluence, of wealth, etc., equal to what probably takes place in a nation in 1 or 2 centuries. The inhabitants of the capital have some great advantages over those that come from a distance. They have connections, they have money and stock, and, generally speaking, in their early years, they possess a more ready and marketable knowledge. But all these avail nothing against habits of industry, and being taught to expect nothing from others, but to depend all on one's own powers. With this single but signal advantage, the sons of the wealthy citizens are always yielding to the son of the peasant. They are one by one giving way, and their places are filled by a new race, while their descendants are sinking into poverty and filling prisons, poorhouses, and hospitals. This vicissitude is so observable that it would be unnecessary to dwell upon it were it not of such infinite importance. The alarming and lamentable increase of the poor, in proportion as a nation becomes rich, is a proof that it is not in capital cities alone that the effect takes place, but over the whole of a country. In England, the number of inhabitants is about 6 times the number of those in Scotland, and perhaps it costs twice as much to maintain a poor person in the former as in the latter. The sum necessary for the maintenance of the poor in England may then be reckoned at about 12 times as much as in Scotland, in order to preserve a just proportion between the two countries. But the poor cost more than 60 times as much in England as in Scotland. That is, at least 5 times more than the true proportion that ought to be. This, it may be said, is owing to the different manner of managing the business, and, in some degree, it no doubt is. But, as the poor are only maintained in England, and as they are also maintained in Scotland, it would be wrong to allow so great a difference for that alone. In order, however, to put the matter out of all doubt, let us compare England with itself, and we shall find that the poor's rates, or the expense of maintaining the indigent, has increased more rapidly than the price of provisions, or the price of labor. This ought not to be the case, as they would only have augmented in the same proportion, unless the number of poor was increased, as well as the price of the provisions they eat, at the same time that the nation is growing more wealthy. Of whom do the poor in every nation consist, but of the lame, the sick, the infirm, the aged, or children unprovided for? Of those, the number, in proportion to the total number of inhabitants, will be pretty nearly the same at all times, for it is nature that produces this species of helpless poverty. It would then appear that there is another species of poverty, not of nature's creation, that comes in and destroys the proportion. It would likewise appear that that new species of poverty is occasioned by the general wealth, since it increases in proportion to it. If we find, then, that the increase of wealth renders the descendants of a particular family helpless and unable to maintain their place in society, if we find also that it gives those portions of a country which are the least advanced an advantage over those which are the most advanced, and if we find that the number of indigent increase most where the wealth is greatest, we surely must allow that there is a strong tendency to decay that accompanies the acquisition of wealth. The same revolutions that arise amongst the rich and poor inhabitants of a country, who change places gradually and without noise, must naturally take place between the inhabitants of rich and poor countries, upon a larger scale and in a more permanent manner. Such changes are generally attended with, or at least productive of, violent commotions. Nations are not subservient to laws like individuals, but make forcible use of the means of which they are possessed to obtain the ends which they have in view. As this tendency is uniformly felt by a number of individuals over the whole of a country when it advances in wealth, and over whole districts that are more advanced than the others, it must operate, in length of time, in producing the decline of a whole nation, as well as it does of a certain portion of its people at all times. Changes in the interior of a nation take place by piecemeal or by degrees. The whole mass sees nothing of it, and indeed it is not felt. But it is vain to think that the same cause that gives the poorer inhabitants of a nation an advantage over the richer will not likewise give poor nations an advantage over rich ones, or at least tend to raise the one and draw down the other. Though we find from the history of the various revolutions that have taken place in different countries that they arose from a variety of causes, some peculiar to one nation and some to another, yet we have found a change of manners and ways of thinking and acting, more or less operating in all of them. Amongst the interior causes of the decline of wealthy nations arising from the wealth itself, we must set this down as one of a very general and natural operation. We must be particularly careful to remove this, as far as possible, if we mean to avert those evils which hitherto have arisen from a superior degree of wealth and power in every nation. We are now going to examine other internal causes, but though they are separate from this, yet this is at the root of all. This is perpetually operating. We meet with it in every corner and at every turning. It is what Mr. Pope says, speaking of the master passion in individuals. The great disease that must destroy at length grows with our growth and strengthens with our strength. This radical case of decline is augmented by an ill-conceived vanity in the parents, as well as by necessity ceasing to act on the children. Each is following a very natural inclination, the one to indulge, the other to be indulged. It is the duty and the interest of the state to counteract this tendency, and the manner how that it is to be done will be inquired into in the first chapter of the third book of this work. But it is not merely a neglect of industry and the means of rising in society, or keeping one's place in it, that is hurtful. The general way of thinking and acting becomes different, and by degrees, the character of a nation is entirely altered. This change was the most rapid and the most observable in the Roman Republic, and was the cause that brought it to an end, and prepared the people for submitting to be ruled by the emperors. The human character was as much degraded under them when the citizens were rich as it ever had been exalted under their consular government, when the people were indigent. The various effects of this change in manners will be considered under different heads, but it is too deeply rooted in human nature ever to be entirely counteracted, much less entirely done away. It is firmly connected with the first principles of action in man, and can no more be removed than his entire nature can be altered. What is in the extreme, if dangerous, may be diminished, and that is all that it would be any way useful to attempt. It may be rendered less formidable in its operation, and that is all that can be expected. The degradation of moral character, the loss of attention to the first principles to which a society owes its prosperity and safety, both of which accompany wealth, are most powerful agents in the decline of nations. We have seen that the Romans, the greatest of all nations, were ruined chiefly by degradation of character, by effeminacy, by ignorance. For we generally find that idleness degenerates, at last, into sloth and inaction. To a love of justice and a power of overcoming danger or of preventing it, listlessness and a total want of energy succeed. At length, the mind becomes estranged from hope, and the body incapable of exertion. This is the case with those who have for a time enjoyed luxury when they begin to decline. Their fall is then inevitable. The Eastern Empire, as well as the Western, fell by this means, and it may be said to have been the ordinary course in the decline of nations that have fallen gradually. The Turks, the Spaniards, and the Portuguese all owe part of their present feebleness to this cause, and the government of France certainly, in a great measure, owed its downfall to the same. There the courtiers had sunk in character, and it was become impossible even for the energy, the activity, and intelligence of the nation at large to counteract the baneful effect of the change that had taken place amongst those who regulated its affairs. In history, we have seen scarcely anything similar to this, for it was the effect operating on the rulers of the nation only. The strength of the great body of the nation on which it did not operate supported that pride and ignorance, whereas in Spain, Portugal, and Turkey, this evil being general throughout the state, those who have the conducting of affairs are held in some check by the general feebleness of the nation. This not only limits the power of action, but is so visible that it is impossible for those who govern not to be led to reflection and to be taught moderation by it. The power of laying on taxes and the means of defending itself against other nations are regulated by the situation of the people, but the wisdom with which the affairs are conducted is dependent on the rulers and those who govern. It is therefore fortunate when the rulers are so far sensible of the feeble state of the country as to be moderate and reasonable. None of the nations that know their own weakness would ever have risked the experiment that was made on St. Domingo by the French. Neither would any nation, in the vigor of acquiring riches, have done so. It required a nation ruled by men who were ignorant of the true principles, who were corrupted with wealth, and, at the same time, had a vigorous nation to govern, to admit of such a situation of things. Had the nation been less wealthy or weaker, so as to have made the poverty or weakness obvious, this could not have happened, or, had the rulers been less corrupted and ignorant, it could not have taken place. In all the interior causes for the decline of nations which we are endeavoring to investigate, we shall find a change of manners and ways of thinking, constantly producing some effect in the direction towards decline. This takes place from the time that a nation becomes more wealthy than its neighbors. Until then, when it is only struggling to equal them, a nation cannot be said to be rich, but to be emerging from poverty. The great aim then should be to counteract this change of mind and manners that naturally attends an increased state of prosperity.
Chapter 2.
The changes of which we have spoken, that take place gradually in a nation, from the increasing luxury and ease in which every succeeding generation is raised, cannot be prevented. They are the natural consequences of the situation of the parents being altered. But when that period of life comes, when children enter upon what is called education, then a great deal may be done. For, though the fathers and mothers have still power over their offspring, it is a diminished power, besides which, they are seldom so much disposed to exert even what power remains, as at an earlier period. It is necessary and fair, after the severe censure that has been passed on parents for bringing up children wrong at an early period, to admit that for the most part they would not run into that error and spoil their children if they were sensible of doing so, and that, as they grow up, they would have them properly instructed, if it were in their power, that is to say, if they had the means. There are certain things for which individuals can pay, but which it is impossible for them to provide individually. And if they attempt to do it collectively, it is liable to great abuse and to be badly done. Individuals never could afford to send their letters from one end of the kingdom to the other without combining together, unless government furnished them the means. But by the aid of the government, they are enabled to do it at a very cheap rate, with expedition and safety, whilst a profit arises to government greater than any regular business in the world produces. There is a possibility of an individual sending a letter by a particular messenger at his own expense to the greatest distance, provided he can afford it. But as it happens, there are many more letters require sending than there are messengers to send, or money to defray the expenses. It is the same with the education of youth. A man may have a tutor to his son and educate him privately if he can afford it. But it happens, as with the letters, that there are many more sons to educate than there are tutors to be found, or money to pay them. As the individual, in the case of the letters, would be obliged to depend on some self-created carrier if government did not interfere, so they are with regard to the education of their children, and, as in the one case they would be very badly served, so they generally are in the other. In the first place, the plans of education are everywhere bad, and the manner of executing still worse. Those to whom the education of youth, one of the most important offices in society, is entrusted undergo no sort of examination to ascertain whether they are fit for the business. They, in general, depend upon their submissive conduct towards the parents and improper indulgence of the children for their success. It was found that the judges of criminal and civil law could not be entrusted with the administration of justice, while they depended on the pleasure of the crown. Can it then be expected that a much more numerous set of men, who are, in every respect, inferior in rank and education to judges, will maintain that upright and correct conduct that is necessary when they are infinitely more dependent than the judges ever were at any period? This is one of the questions that is to be argued on the same principles that the independence, under a monarchical or democratic government, is decided. Under the dominion of one chief, on particular occasions, which occur but seldom, it may be necessary to yield to his will if the ruler is shameless enough and infamous enough to insist upon it. But with a community for one's master, there is a complete system of submission, a perpetual deviation from that which is right. In the first place, the fathers and mothers are no judges themselves of the merits of the master or the proficiency of the boy, whom the master is obliged to treat with indulgence, that he may not complain. Where there is a complete ignorance of the right and wrong of the case, anything will turn the balance, and it is clear that where there is no proof of superior merit, there must be goodwill, flattery, or some other method taken to obtain a preference. There are, occasionally, men of real merit who distinguish themselves as teachers, and who, having a solid claim to a preference, use no mean arts to obtain it. It is but justice to parents in general to say that such men are always encouraged, while they keep their good qualities uncontaminated by some fault that counterbalances them. As this is a case where individuals cannot serve themselves, nor provide the means of being properly served, it is one of those in which the government of every country ought to interfere. Not in giving salaries at the public expense to men who perhaps would do no duty, but in seeing that the men who undertake the task of education are qualified, and that when they have undertaken it they do their duty and follow a proper system. There should be proper examinations from time to time, and registers should be kept of the number of scholars and the satisfaction they have given to those who examined them. Parents would then have a measure by which they could estimate the merit of a school. The master would have another motive for action, and there would be an emulation amongst the scholars. The business professed to be done and undertaken would then be performed. At present, at about 3 times the expense necessary, children learn about half what they are intended to be taught. Interfering in this manner would be no infringement on private liberty. Nothing would be done that could hurt in any way the individuals, but what must greatly benefit them. The evil habits that are contracted in early childhood at home would be counteracted, and the youth would be taught to know what it is that renders a man happy in himself and respected and valued by society. But the consideration of the system to be followed is not the least important part of the business. The useful should be preferred to the useless, and in this the example of the ancients might be followed with advantage. They had no dead languages to study, and the mind appears to have been in many cases expanded, far beyond its present compass. Nothing, indeed, can equal the ignorance of the most part of boys when they leave school. Those who are considered as bad scholars have lost the good opinion of themselves that ought to be maintained throughout life. They think everything difficult or impossible. Those, again, who have excelled are something less ignorant, but become vain and conceited, owing perhaps to their having learnt some useless and superfluous pieces of knowledge. Education, on the general principle, consists in learning what makes a man useful, respectable, and happy in the line for which he is destined, whether for manual labor or for study, for a high or a low occupation. What is useful becomes a question, in some sort depending upon place, and still more on circumstances. It will therefore be better to discuss it at length in the third book, where England is the place, and particular circumstances are taken into consideration. There are, however, some general rules that apply to all places and to all situations. Good principles, honor, honesty, and integrity are equally necessary in every rank of society. With those qualities, even a beggar is respectable and will be respected. Without them, no man ever was or ever will be so. In every mode of education, the importance of those should be inculcated, and that they may be adhered to, every man, either by inheritance or by talents or by habits of industry, should have it put in his power to command the means of living in the way that he has been brought up. Were this attended to, many scenes of misery and vice would be prevented. Admitting that there are propensities in some minds that led to evil, independent of every possible check or control, it must be allowed that the far greater proportion of those who do well or ill in the world owe it to the manner in which they have been brought up in their early days. It follows from this general rule that parents should carefully avoid bringing up children in a manner in which they have not the means of being afterwards maintained, and that, in the second place, when they cannot leave them in an independent fortune, they should, by making them learn a trade or profession, give them the means of obtaining what they have been accustomed to consider as necessary for them to enjoy. There are indeed great numbers, and the greatest numbers of all, unable even to have their children taught what is called a trade. But there are none whom poverty prevents from bringing their children up to industry. And, if they have been taught to live according to their situation, they will find themselves above their wants, and therefore the same general rule will still apply. Most writers have considered the subject of education as relative to that portion of it only which applies to learning. But the first object of all, in every nation, is to make a man a good member of society, and this can never be done unless he is fitted to fill the situation of life for which he is intended. Governments and writers on education fall, generally speaking, into the same errors. They would provide for the education of persons destined for the learned professions and sometimes for the fine arts, but agriculture, commerce, and manufactures are totally left out. The most essential, the most generally useful, are not noticed at all. As so much value is set upon the language of the Greeks and Romans, surely we might pay a little attention to the example of those distinguished nations. The Greeks studied the Egyptian learning and improved upon it, but this was only confined to those who followed learning as a profession, or whose means allowed them to prosecute it as a study. The common education of citizens was different. It consisted in teaching them to perform what was useful and to esteem what was excellent. It was a principle with them that all men ought to know how happiness is attained and in what virtue consists, but they neither trusted to precept nor example. They enforced by habit and practice, and in this the Romans followed the plan the Greeks had laid down, and by that means they surpassed all other nations. When those great nations of antiquity abandoned their attention to the useful parts of education, they soon sunk in national character. It so happens, in this case, that the mode of education and the manners of a people are so closely connected that it is difficult from observation to know which is the cause and which the effect. Youth, badly educated, make bad men, and bad men neglect the education of their children. They set them a wrong example. Such is the case when a government does not interfere. How this is to be done with advantage is the question. Writers on political economy have in general considered female education as making no part of the system. But surely, if the wealth and happiness of mankind is the end in view, there can scarcely be a greater object, for none is more nearly connected with it. Let it be granted that, in the first instance, women are not educated with any view to carry on those labors and manufactures on which wealth is considered as depending. Let all this be admitted, and that, in an early state of life, they are of no importance in this respect. Yet, surely, when they become wives and mothers, when the economy of the family and the education of the younger children depend chiefly on them, they are then of very great importance to society. Their conduct in that important situation must be greatly influenced by their education. Female education ought then to be considered as one of the things on the conducting of which the prosperity of a state does in a great measure depend. It ought, therefore, to be attended to in the same manner as the education of youth of the other sex. In this case, also, so much depends on place and circumstances that we shall follow the same rule as with male education. It shall be treated of as for England, and with the different ranks of society as they are. But there are some general rules not to be forgotten, and which are applicable to all places and all countries. The great error in female education does not consist in neglecting to instill good principles, for that is, in most countries, for obvious reasons, pretty well attended to. But good principles, without the means of adhering to them, are of little avail. If a desire for dress or other enjoyments that cannot be gratified fairly, and by the means of which they are possessed, are encouraged, principles will be abandoned in order to gratify passions. Females are taught frivolous accomplishments in place of what would be useful, and expensive vanity is substituted for that modest dignity that should be taught. The consequence is that, in every rank of life, according to her station, the woman aims at being above it, and affects the manners and dress of her superiors. There is too much pains taken with adorning the person, and too little with instructing the mind, in every civilized country. And when women are wise and good and virtuous, it is more owing to nature than to education. As indeed, the duties of a woman, in ordinary life, are of a nature more difficult to describe than those of a man, who, when he has learnt a trade, has little more to do, the care employed in seeing that proper persons only are entrusted with the important office of teaching them to perform those duties ought to be proportionally great. The farther remarks on the subject of education are deferred to the fourth book, where place and circumstances come into consideration. It is, however, to be observed that in all cases, as a nation becomes more wealthy, the business of education becomes more important, and has a natural tendency to be worse managed. It therefore demands a double share of attention. If the women of a nation are badly educated, it must have a great effect on the education of their sons and the conduct of their husbands. The Spartan and Roman mothers had the glory of making their sons esteem bravery and those qualities in a man that were most wanted in their state of society. It should be one part of female education to know and admire the qualities that are estimable in the other sex. To obtain the approbation of the other sex is, at a certain time of life, the greatest object of ambition, and it is never a matter of indifference. The great general error consists in considering the woman merely in her identical self, without thinking of her influence on others. It appears to be for this reason that writers on political economy have paid no attention to female education. But we find no state in which the virtue of men has been preserved, where the women had none, though there are examples of women preserving their virtues, notwithstanding the torrent of corruption by which that of the men has been swept away.
This concludes today's reading of an inquiry into the permanent causes of the decline and fall of powerful and wealthy nations, by William Playfair. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.